concentrated on John H. Driscoll's family, immediate family, and your memories of that. And today, Sean and I thought that it would be a good idea to focus on John A. Rooney, because I know very little about him, have seen very few pictures, and we've had some difficulty coming up with pictures of John A. Rooney. But there is a rather extended family, and we'd like to start with that and see what you remember.
Okay. I'll probably need your crib sheet here.
Yep.
Because it gets a little complicated. But we're all descended from, on the Rooney side, we're all descended from Patrick Rooney and Kate Connell.
Okay.
And they were the great-great-grandparents. They were the fathers of my grandfather, John A. Rooney. And Patrick was born in 1831, and I don't know when Kate was born, but around the same time. Sean has all these records. And he was born, and as was his wife, in Ireland, in Roscommon.
Okay.
And which is one of the counties.
Thanks, Bill.
Edification.
Thank you.
And they begat John A. Rooney, born in 1865, who was my grandfather. But going back to John A. Rooney's immediate family, there were five kids. There was Patrick Jr., there was Margaret, who we called Auntie, and I'll get to that in a minute, if you're still awake.
I'll try.
Mary, John, obviously our grandfather, and Kate. Okay, so start with Patrick. Patrick Jr. had a son, John, and this is where it gets very complicated. More Johns in the family, no offense to you.
I feel lost.
And he had a son, John, who begat 4 or 5 kids, but 2 of them I remember very well. One was Pauline Rooney, and they, during the Depression years in the 1930s, had fallen on hard times. And Pauline was taken in by Mother and Daddy as a helpmate to Mary Kilkenny, our maid at the time. So Pauline came to work for us, but it was really a soporific to the family who was on hard times. One of her brothers was a guy named Buddy Rooney, and I have a great memory in 1937. Buddy was a bat boy for the Boston Braves baseball team.
Really?
And Buddy invited me. He'd be 2 or 3 years older than I was at the time, probably older, probably half a dozen years.
I don't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, no.
Did Buddy live with you two?
No, only Pauline.
Only Pauline.
And the rest of the family was either farmed out or I just don't know. But Buddy was a bat boy. And so he invited me in 1937 to a Boston Braves baseball game at Braves Field. But in those days it was called the Boston Bees. And he helped me to get the autographs of almost all of the team, which is a big thrill for me. And I have it in the book here, my scrapbook from my youth. And in it, in the scrapbook, is the page from my autograph book. And that listing of players at that time for the Boston Bees team is, if you know baseball, and I'm not that much of a fan of it, is really impressive. I can't find it right here at this moment. But listed in there are guys like Dom DiMaggio, Joe DiMaggio's brother, his brother Vince. Two of them were on the team at that time. Joe, of course, never played for the Boston Bees. He was only with the Yankees. And the other name that stands out for anybody that knows baseball history was Al Lopez, one of the great catchers of all time. It's in here. I don't find it, but it's a treasure that I hope somebody will watch over in the years to come. So that's the story of Patrick Jr. Margaret was the next in line. Now we're going back to Dar Rooney's siblings. And Margaret was called Auntie, and she never married. And she had a sister, Mary, and Mary married a man named Jim Scully. And they begat a bunch of children, among which was Tom Scully. And he was sort of a rogue, vanished into the wild geese off and on, obviously had a drinking problem. But at the time that I was acquainted with him, he worked for the Boston Traveler, as did his wife, Ann. And Ann was a telephone operator at the Boston Herald Traveler. And they lived with Auntie in Hyde Park, in the house that my grandfather had grown up in Hyde Park, that had been Patrick Sr.'s before they died. Auntie raised Tom and the other Scully children because Mary died, I don't know when, but she had the care of her sister's children. So they were raised by the maiden aunt that we called Auntie. And I remember Auntie very well. She was Dar's sister, an older sister. And I remember her coming up to Deering, and that would have been 1936, 1937. And she had a stroke up there, but I guess recovered afterwards. But I remember her being taken ill out on the porch at Deering.
Mm-hmm.
She was a big woman, and records show that the house down in Hollichport, from the guest books down there, is called Eagle's Nest. And from the guest book that we have, dating back to the early 1900s, 1904, 1905, Auntie was a presence down there with the Scully children, and of course with Mother and her siblings. And that, I had many memories of stories told about Auntie. She had a big car, and this Tom, the ne'er-do-well, at that time drove around in this big car. And while I don't remember it firsthand, I remember my older brothers and sisters talking about they hated to go off on a day trip with Auntie in the big car because she would take them, beach plum picking. And beach plum picking was a source of great embarrassment to them because Auntie would spot some beach plums and there'd be clearly signs saying no trespassing and no beach plum picking. And she'd say, "Nonsense, Thomas, stop the car." And he'd stop the car. She'd open the door and say, "God meant them to be picked. Out, children, over the wall, over the wall." So that's the kind of vigorous woman that Auntie was. Going on, there was a Kate, Sister Kate, who married a man named McMorrow. I have no idea what happened to them. until I looked at the records that Sean had gotten hold of. I had forgotten that name, but it was a name that was sort of peripheral when I was growing up. So that's sort of very briefly is that layer and what happened to them.
Now, Bill, as I said before, I don't know a lot about John A. Rooney. But I do know, think that I know, that he left home to work at a very early age.
Yeah.
And I don't know the details of that.
Well, the details in family law, as always, get a little bit sketchy. But as best we can piece together, he left school in Hyde Park at age 14.
14?
Yeah. And from age 14 to age 21, he worked in the building trade. Now that sounds grand, but he was basically a hod carrier. And he did learn a bit about masonry and so forth. He worked for a family called Norcross, and I think they were out in Great Barrington, Massachusetts.
Did he live out there?
Oh yeah,
Had to.
yeah. Well, we don't know that, but obviously Great Barrington is a long way from Hyde Park.
Yeah.
And we do know that in that interval between 14 and age 21, when he was working in the so-called building trade, either Norcross or somebody else that he worked for got a big job building granite or stone buildings on a big estate near Atlanta, Georgia. And he went down there to work on that project.
Okay.
And being a dutiful son, he sent part of his earnings home. And there starts the horror story that Mother told me, which I'll get to in a minute. But at any rate, he came back from Georgia. Family lore has it that he decided that he had had enough of being a virtual laborer in the construction trade, and they didn't want to carry a hod for the rest of his life, and that he should go finish his education. So he went to see the principal, and there's some family dispute over whether it was the principal or the librarian. But at any rate, he went to see a person named Elliot, Mr. Elliot, in Hyde Park, who was connected at any rate with the high school, and arranged for him at age 21 to continue or to get his high school diploma. And strangely enough, or miracle of miracles, to get him admitted to MIT.
At what age?
Well, he was 21, according to the records we have, that he came back and went there. He became enrolled at MIT and graduated with a class of 91. 91, so he was born in 65, 75, 85, 20, 91. He was 26 years old when he graduated from MIT. 2 years later, in 1893, he marries Catherine Cusack, my grandmother. And the first child was my mother, your grandmother, who was born in 1894. Now, to digress for a minute to go back to one of the horror stories of the family, and these kind of things are uncovered, but they should be remembered. I remember Mother telling me that the first time that she ever saw her father cry was when they were living on Temple Street. Mother was born on Temple Street in West Roxbury. And somewhere, Sean, we have the picture of the Temple Street house, and I've got it somewhere. But at any rate, that was the Temple Street house, and Mother remembers the phone ringing and Da getting on the phone and getting off and crying. And when she and my grandmother said, "What's going on?" and so forth, he said, "My mother just died." And the poignancy of the story is that he and his mother hadn't spoken from the time that he went back to finish his education and then go to MIT.
Oh.
She refused to speak to him. She never went to the wedding with my grandmother in 1993. And as far as she was concerned, he didn't exist.
Persona non grata.
Persona non grata, exactly. And it's a terrible story, but it shows, well, you know, as a kid, when I heard that story from Mother, I referred to her as a battle axe or something like that, as a kid will do, and Mother sort of, you know, I guess in a way agreed. But it was too much of a lady to say, "You're right, son." She was a battle axe. But she obviously never knew her.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a sad, sad thing. But after that, when, after she died, the rapport or the contacts were made again from Rooney and his father.
I see.
And his father used to come over from Hyde Park, Mother said, and visit with them on Temple Street. And they would go over to Hyde Park and visit with Grandpa or whatever she called him. I forget what it was. And of course, Auntie would have been there in those days. The Auntie that I mentioned.
And the Scully children.
And the Scully children would have been there.
Yeah.
At the time that she'd go over for a visit.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, you know, sort of that connection.
Now, as I understand it, John A.
Rooney.
Rooney,
Yeah.
married Catherine Cusack.
Yeah.
What year was that, Bill?
93. He graduated in 1893.
Right.
He graduated in 1891 from MIT. 2 years later, he marries Catherine Cusack.
Mm-hmm.
A year later, 1894, they have their first child, which is our grandmother,
My grandmother,
my mother.
Catherine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And from there, you go on. But
Well, they, from the tree, Ganner, my Ganner, was the oldest.
Yeah.
Then there was John.
No, it was B,
Margaret, and then John.
and then John.
John is the youngest, Margaret the second, and Ganner the oldest.
Right. If you want to go down that route, let's do it logically.
Mm-hmm.
Mother and Daddy had 7 children.
Right.
We'll get into them in the future. We don't run out of film.
Tape.
The next in line was Margaret, who we call B.
Right.
And she married a man named Tom McSweeney.
Okay.
And they lived in Hingham, Massachusetts. And as a wedding present from Da and Ganner Rooney, Da built them, or was caused to be built, a beautiful home that is there today. And it was very much like 100 Grayfield Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't gone into that. When we moved to 99 Grayfield Avenue, Da and Ganner built the house across the street,
Mm-hmm.
which was all of granite. And I assume we'll get into that another time. But he did the same for his daughter Margaret, who we call B.
Yep.
And I visited that house within the last 2 or 3 years, and it's absolutely gorgeous, still there. It's been added on to and so forth. They had 2 children. My cousin Brian,
Mm-hmm.
who is alive today, and you remember him coming to Eddie's funeral.
I do.
Huge,
Big beard.
full beard, big, huge
Big guy.
Yeah. And he had a sister, Brenda, who was about my age, a little bit older than I was, maybe a year older than I was. And she died. She was married to a man named Roy Arena.
Mm-hmm.
And they had children who lived from the South Shore this day, so they're second cousins 27 times removed or something, but I'm not in contact with them.
Yeah.
Then the youngest child of Di and Ganna Rooney was John Hugh Rooney.
Okay.
And he was one of my all-time favorite uncles. He was a wonderful, wonderful guy. And as you said, he married Eileen Flaherty.
Right.
And that was another Boston Irish family. And they had your cousins, starting with Eileen, and then Johnny, who's a little bit younger than I am, then Kath, who lives up here in Keene,
Right.
married to Doug Lowe,
Mm-hmm.
and the youngest is Jimmy, cousin Jimmy,
Yeah.
who's done extremely well in the music business. He's a well-recognized producer of what we would call country music, bluegrass, and all that kind of thing. Is really virtually world renowned or world known and so forth. And he lives up in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the issue of that layer, starting with mother is Catherine B. Margaret McSweeney, and John Hugh Rooney, married to Eileen Flaherty.
But Bill, the part of the family that obviously I don't know very well is Margaret's family, Margaret McSweeney's family.
Yeah.
And they had children.
Yeah.
Do you remember those children?
Well, as I said before, there was Brian and Brendy.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I remember we had quite a bit of contact when I was young. As I said, they lived down in Hingham. Di had built them a beautiful stone house after an Irish manor house of the same scale and so forth. And next to it was Triphammer Pond. And we used to go down there quite often. It was a day's drive down and back from West Roxbury to Hingham, but for picnics.
Mm-hmm.
And across the street is Union Street in Hingham. And across the street in those days was a huge dairy farm named Hunster's Dairy Farm. And as a kid, it was wonderful to get down there and watch the cows and watch them coming back into the milk barn, all that kind of stuff. And a couple of stories to do with that. Years later, a friend of mine named Wilbur Turner had married his new wife, Barbara, I forget her last name, but they came from Bucks.
Mm-hmm.
And so their first house, or second house, maybe they had an apartment for a short while, they bought a house down in Hingham.
Mm-hmm.
And that was at a place called Land's End or World's End. So at Thanksgiving or some other gathering when Aunt B, you throw me when you say Margaret, because nobody ever called her Margaret except my mother and her husband Tom. But Aunt B was a wonderful conversation. She had a kind of a confidential voice, talked like that. And I said to B at this occasion, I said, some friends of mine just moved down to Hingham, B. And she said, is that right? Where'd they move to? And I said, a place called Land's End, World's End. Oh, she said, boy, they must be rich. And I said, I'm quite sure they don't have to worry where the next penny is coming from, but why do you say that? She said, that's up the approach to Boston Harbor. And she said, they've developed all these houses out there. And she said, all of Hingham has become rich. It's a lot different from when we first moved there after I was married. And she said, I want a friend. I said, sure. She said, well, I was in the market within the last week or so, and she said the lady was checking out at the market ahead of me. Now, in those days, they didn't have supermarkets.
Right.
They were waited on and so forth. She said the lady ahead of me took out a checkbook to pay the bill. And she said, I didn't mean to peek, but I couldn't help it. It was right there. And she said she had over $1,000 in a checking account. I said, well, that is rich. Yeah, that kind of money. She said, you know what I did, boy? And I said, no. She said, I went home and I wrote $1,000 balance in front of mine. I know it isn't there, but if in case anybody peeks. But that was the kind of down to earth lady I'd be with. And another story which always amuses Sean and so forth. I suppose I shouldn't tell it, but it's indicative. When Brendy got married to this fellow named Roy Arena, the barber down there in Norfolk or someplace near Hingham, and we were invited to the wedding, of course, and Bea thought it incumbent upon her to tell Mother before the wedding, when they had a little conversation, she said, Kath, I have something to tell you. And she said, what's that? She said, Brendy's in the family way. And this is before the wedding. And Mother said, oh, Marnie, she called her Marnie. Oh, Marnie, that's, she said, that's awful, but she was taken aback by this scandal. And Bea said, oh, don't worry so, Kath. So, you know, you gotta understand, Brendy's a child of nature. So ever since that.
Bill, what I don't know a lot about, I know that, as you said, John A. Graduated from MIT, and there is some fuzzy memory that I have about his quarry. There was some rumor that when I was at Yale that some of the granite came from his quarry. I don't know anything about the quarry, and I understand also that he had several appointed positions in the construction trade. What do you know about that?
Okay, let's go back. He's married. He graduates from MIT in '91, and he goes into business. The details of that, you know, he started in his own business, which was in the granite quarrying business. And he went on from there to become the owner of the Pilgrim Granite Company. And they quarried and built with what they call Braintree Weymouth seam face. Now, that is granite, and everybody's perception of granite, or most everybody's perception of granite, is gray and black, and it's sort of the Monument of the Ages, and Barry, Vermont, and all that. That's the most well-known granite, and that's the building granite. You see the hitching posts and all that kind of stuff. And that's sort of New Hampshire granite, Vermont granite, if you will. But Braintree Weymouth seam face, because of, you know, geological reasons, eons and eons ago, came out in a brownish, almost a rust color. Right. Very distinctive.
Yeah.
And it was a sought-after stone. It was a premium stone because it was only quarried in that area down there. And Dar owned and operated the Pilgrim Granite Corporation, and he was also at one point the president of the I've forgotten the name of it, but it was the Builders Association of Massachusetts. So that was a big job. The thing that most impressed me as a kid was that he was also building commissioner for the city of Boston.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that was 19 '06, '07, and '08.
All right.
And he was appointed to that job. That's a big job. I mean, that's an
Absolutely.
appointed job, but he is the building commissioner of the entire city of Boston. And as a badge of his office, he literally had a gold badge.
Mm-hmm.
And as an aside, I remember looking at that as a kid and being very impressed with this gold badge. And when he died, when Rooney died, he left 3 prized possessions to his 3 oldest grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
So your father, Jack, inherited his gold watch,
Which I still have.
which you of course still have. He left to Brian his gold-headed cane.
Mm-hmm.
A gold-headed cane, and he was very distinguished when he walked around and so forth with that cane. And Johnny Rooney,
Mm-hmm.
my cousin who lives now in Chicago, got the commissioner's badge.
Mm-hmm.
And the story in the family about him being commissioner, obviously he was running the Pilgrim Granite Company at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But he was appointed to that by John H. Fitzgerald, Honey Fitz.
Mm-hmm.
The
And that was Rose Kennedy's father.
Rose Kennedy's father, President Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy, and Teddy Kennedy's grandfather.
Right.
And he was appointed to that position as building commissioner of the city of Boston in 1906, and he served until 1908. And then the family story was he had a dispute with the mayor, and that he quit because of political interference, some nonsense like that. And some people in the family attributed that to James Michael Curley. Curley was nowhere in the scene at that point.
Mm-hmm.
The guy's name I forget, but Sean looked it up, and there's a name like Banahan or something like that, and he was a Republican. I'm talking about the mayor that succeeded Honey Fitz.
Yep.
Honey Fitz was in 1906 to 1907, was out of office 08 and 09, replaced by this Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And then Honey Fitz got the mayoralty back in 1910, 11. And the presumption is that Rooney had been appointed by Honey Fitz, and the new guy wanted a room that would sweep clean or something.
Sure.
And the reason it was delayed by a year because the appointment was for 3 years or something. That's all assumption.
Yeah.
But the family story about Curley being involved is
Not true.
Not true at all.
Yeah.
No. So that basically is his work thing. He goes to work after MIT, he becomes big in the Building Trades Association, he heads up the Pilgrim Granite Association, and then eventually that Weymouth Braintree seam face became very expensive to use, the decline, all of a sudden World War II comes along, and the quarries that were still quarrying sort of consolidated under some amalgamation where they worked one quarry for 3 months and then moved to another one. But the whole business had gone to hell.
Fell apart.
It fell apart.
Yeah.
Part of it was because of the development of artificial stone. You could make seam face. Incidentally, your father worked one summer.
Yeah.
For Dow Rooney when there was still some building going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I've driven up to Glens Falls, New York, when I was picking up David up at Skidmore, and you can go through Glens Falls, because I knew that your father had worked one summer on a church up there, built with Dye's granite. And it's so easy to find when you go to a city or a town, if you know there's some Dye's granite there, all you have to do is drive around, and the first time you see a church that's rust-colored granite, that's it. Including, incidentally, St. Teresa's Church in West Roxbury.
Oh, really?
When we went as kids, that was built with Dodge granite.
Well, I can say firsthand that there was a lot of that colored granite at Yale. So it's possible
Yeah.
that some of that stuff came from there. It's hard to know. That's what I'm.
He was, as a kid, he was a big man, and somewhere there's a picture of him along with Daddy.
We have it right here.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Here's a picture of Da Rooney, and in the middle, Jim Wilson. When we get into Deering, I can tell about Jim Wilson, another great character in our lifetime. And then Daddy on the other side, and then Robin is the little boy.
Oh, that's Robin, not you.
That's Robin. No, that's Robin.
Okay.
But there's a picture of Da, and you can see he wasn't all that big, but to a child he was big.
Pretty large man.
But getting back to the quarry, he favored an arm. He never had the full use of one of his arms, and it had been as an injury in the quarry.
In the quarry.
And of course, as a kid, I used to tell people, they say, "What's wrong with your grandfather's arm?" I say, "A big boulder fell on." Absolutely not true, but I know that he always favored that arm.
Yeah.
And this is another aside. As a kid, he grew up. I grew up with him in the house for his meals, at least breakfast and dinner. He'd come across the street because my grandmother, Catherine Cusack, died in 1933. So he lived right across the street, and we used to. He used to come over and take his meals there and so forth. And when he fully retired, when the whole granite business folded and so forth, he'd be sitting in the afternoon, and I'd come home from school and be in the living room, and I can remember him now. He'd punch me with a bad arm and say, "See if the Boston transcripts come. Go see if that's come." And he read the Boston Transcript newspaper every day. And when that went out of business, he went to the Christian Science Monitor. No newspaper with pictures. There's no need for that.
Right, yeah, didn't the Boston Traveler didn't even have headlines, right?
No, the Traveler did.
Oh, it did?
This is the transcript.
Oh, the
Boston
transcript.
transcript.
Right, and then it didn't have, headlines were too sensationalist or something.
Oh, yeah. If you happen to make a statement that was way off the path of reality, he'd look at you scornfully and say, "Don't betray your ignorance." He was kind of a powerful guy in my eyes.
What year did he die, Bill?
1940 or 41. I can remember him dying there, thinking about that. It was the first time, unfortunately, I haven't had too many times since of witnessing it. I didn't witness it, but as I say, he lived across the street in his house at 100 Greenfield Avenue. As I recall, it was April of the year, but I'm not sure of that. But at any rate, he was taken really stricken, and for some reason, they moved him across the street into Sheila and Kay's room on the second floor of Grayfield Avenue.
Grayfield Avenue.
Yeah, but it was very brief. It was like for a day or two. Obviously, he didn't want him to go to a hospital. And he came across, and to this day, I can remember the noise that he was making from this room, and obviously be attended by a nurse and everything else. And I remember being a little disturbed by this, which is kind of unsettling, of course. And I remember Daddy saying to me, "Don't worry, dear, he's now where he doesn't know what's going on, and he is going on." And that was his way of saying, "Yeah, I was dying."
Yeah.
And that's really, it's a strange memory, but it sticks out, when we go over this kind of stuff. He did die at 99 Grayfield Avenue. And the only other part of that I remember was that there was sort of a debate over who would go to the funeral whether Robin and I would go. I don't remember whether Robin went, because he would have been 5 years old, so.
Did you go?
I did go, and I remember being very impressed with one of the songs that they played was Going Home, da, 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 da. First time I heard it, every time I hear it since, I remember the first funeral that I went to.
Yeah.
Childhood memories.
Well, Bill, how much contact did you have with your grandfather?
Well, there's two phases of that. One, as I said, he lived across the street. Dana died. This is the 30s, late 30s, and he took breakfast and certainly dinner at our house. And I guess during the earlier part of that, he would have gone to work. I remember he had a 1935 gray Ford two-door sedan, a stick shift. He never referred to tires. He'd say, "My machine needs new shoes." Tires were not his vocabulary. The tires on the car were shoes. But at any rate, he came over for at least breakfast, maybe went off to lunch down to his work or not, and then was there at dinner time. And, we always ate at the table as a family, and I was always a big presence there. And your father and Eddie went over, because there's that house across the street of Di's, he lived in all alone, and he had, 2 or 3 other bedrooms, and it just seemed to make sense for Jack and Eddie to bunk over there, as they called it. And so they slept for, I don't know, their father might have been at Harvard at the time, I don't know. But I remember them living there, and I think maybe Phil lived over
Phil
there
too?
as well. I'm not sure of that.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
But that was that phase of it. And then, of course, the other phase, and much more in my memory, was deering. Because Da loved deering.
Oh.
And by this time, he was pretty much fully retired. So that picture of Robin and Daddy and Da and Jim Rooney,
Jim Wilson.
were memories that I had, because we spent all summers, and Da took the entire summer off. He lived as you went into Deering, and you will remember Deering.
Yes.
Remember the organ room on the first floor?
Yep.
That was his bedroom,
Oh.
facing the mountain.
Yeah.
And that was his bedroom when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And he got up at 5:30, 5:45 every morning, and went out to his garden. He was a great gardener, loved it. And he would come back in 7:30. Mary Kenny would be up and rattled his breakfast and stuff like that, or mother, whoever. And he'd holler up the stairs, "Bill, get up, get up. The sun will burn you out of bed."
He stayed there even when the family went back down to Boston.
Well, yeah, but the family was mother and daddy went back to Boston.
Right.
They came up on weekends.
And he stayed the entire week.
He stayed for the entire summer. Occasionally he'd go down.
Yeah.
And you always knew when he was taking off, whether it's to go to Mass on Sunday, early Mass, or when he was leaving to go to Boston. He revved that, I mentioned, 1935 Ford. He'd be out there going, vroom, 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 and he'd pull the car into the air, vroom. Up he'd go.
Now, Sean is mentioned in episode or an interaction between Dar Rooney and your friends.
Oh, my friends. That goes back to West Roxbury. I had good friends. The Kellys lived diagonally across the street on Mount Vernon Street.
Mhm.
in a big white house with a surround porch all the way around it. And that was the music critic of the New York Times was there. I can't recall his name right now, but that was a summer house in those days. West Roxbury is still a summer house to some Boston family, summer place for some Boston families. Downs, Oldham Downs, I don't know. But anyway, the Kelly family lived over there, and there was many Kellys as there were Driscolls. And then 2 houses down from that, opposite our tennis court, which is in the back of the house at Grapefruit Avenue, lived the Keefs. And there were 3,421 Keefs as well, and Buddy Keefe and Muggsy Kelly and Billy Driscoll were a triumvirate.
Yeah.
And Rooney never referred to them as Muggsy and Buddy, but Bugsy and Muddy. When I would correct him and say, it's good enough the way I said it. That annoyed the hell out of me. And he obviously did it to her.